Hi, and welcome to this lecture on assessment. Now, we're going to have a look at the three broad types of assessment: diagnostic, formative, and summative, or as you might read in the literature as assessment for, as, and of learning. Now, this is an important point to make because assessment has become a bit of a dirty word in recent time. So we're really going to address that because really I think it's been a little bit misunderstood in terms of the current use of assessment in terms of being a big stick that we punish students with and also teachers with. So what I want to do is just reframe and redirect the discussion of assessment for its real purpose, which is to really drive the learning process. Okay? So as always, the learning objective, we've got a learning objective here. So by the end of this lecture, I want you to be able to state what each of those types of assessment is for, its timing, when does it occur in the learning process, but also give me some examples of diagnostic, formative, and summative tools that you can use. Now, what's different in this lecture, and it's quite obvious, is the success criteria. So when you're teaching, this is pretty much what you're going to have in either on the board or as one of the slides in your PowerPoint. If you're going to teach with PowerPoint, you'll have your learning objective or your WALT. We are learning to, so that's the STEM. So then your learning objective should directly just finish that STEM of we are learning to. So then the first thing that should appear in your sentence is that cognitive verb. In this case, it is state. And so that's essentially just recall. That's the lowest level remembering. Okay? Now what's different here is the success criteria or the WILF. So this is how I'm going to have you judge whether you've been successful in learning the material in this lesson or in this lecture. Okay? So there's a table coming along in a moment. And if you are going to aim for a 1 star, then you're going to add 3 points to the table. If you're aiming for a 2 star, then you're going to add 5 points, and 3 star, you're going to add 7 additional points to what is already in the table. Okay, so these are dot points, and they can be anywhere in the table. Okay, so 3 points, 5 points, or 7 points. That's how you're going to determine the degree to which you are successful in this lecture. Okay? Excellent. So why assess students? Okay. So yes, we assess at all points in the learning process, but at the end of the day, the real reason why we assess students because it drives the learning and teaching process. Yeah. So and it drives every part of the learning and teaching process. So we'll just go through this graphic here in terms of the learning cycle. So the first thing that needs to happen is that we as teachers, we need to establish the learning outcomes. That's what I did here, yeah? So here's my learning objective, there we go. Then what we do is we provide the learning opportunities. That is where you decide, okay, so what text do I want students to interact with? What tools am I going to give them? Or what tool, what menu of tools am I going to offer the students to use? How am I going to get students to work individually, pairs, or whole class, and so forth. And then the third step is assessing student learning. Now, what is so good about this success criteria, and success criteria written in this way, is that it is designed for the student perspective, because what I'm trying to encourage here is that you become reflective in your teaching, that you become self-monitoring in your learning. So this is a tool for you to use, okay? And that's one of the things that makes learning student-centered. Okay, so the whole point of the learning process is to really drive this process. So that assessment of student learning. Now, I can either assess the students, so we can either do teacher assessment, or we can do self-assessment, or we can do student assessment. So they are your options. Regardless of who is doing the assessment, what's really important is that that information is then used to make decisions about the next steps, the next learning outcomes. Do we need to go back and revisit? So we can use this information, this student assessment of student learning, to assess the degree of movement, the degree of progression. We can use it to determine the level of achievement, or we can use it to determine the effectiveness of that teaching. Okay, so NAPLAN claims to do those things, and that's one of the clear examples of where we use assessment to answer those three questions. How far have students come in terms of, say, numeracy skills and literacy skills between year 7 and 9? So that's progress. How much progress has been achieved in that time? We can assess the level of achievement. So in relation to other students, where does any particular student sit in relation to like peers? And we can also use NAPLAN results to determine the effectiveness of teaching, either at the individual level or at the class level or even at the state level. Okay? So what I would like you to do is to have a think about what are the reasons for assessment from the student's perspective. So put your mind in the student seat and have a think, why are we assessing learning, and why is that important to students? Okay? So there are reasons of why assessment is important to students. There are also reasons of why assessment is important to teachers. So yes, there's me as a teacher and how am I going to plan lessons, but also then think about the teacher and how that teacher belongs to the educational system. So where else would that information about the amount of learning which has taken place, who else would use that? Just not the teachers. So think about systems and schools. Think about that level. Okay? So in terms of reading, go ahead and watch this particular video here. So it goes through each of the types of assessment: formative, summative, and diagnostic. Now, I prefer to talk about it as diagnostic, formative, and summative, because then that places it in the correct temporal position within the learning sequence. So diagnostic tends to happen first, formative tends to happen during, and summative happens at the end. So there's a number of key things which actually determine whether something is diagnostic, formative, or summative, and that's what we're going to go through here. Now, earlier when I was talking about that table that I'd like you to add either 3 points, 5 points, or 7 points, this is it here. So I'm going to give you some basic information, but then I'm going to ask you to add more information to that. Okay? So let's start at the start. When you go to a doctor or you go to a health professional, one of the first things that they'll do is they'll diagnose you. Yeah? They've got to determine how well are you. So on the scale from unwell to well, whereabouts are you on that scale? Okay? Are you right near death, or are you super healthy? Regardless of where you sit, the doctor has to determine where you sit on that continuum, but then also find out extra information that if you are sick, how are we going to move you towards being well? Okay? So diagnostic assessment is the assessment that you do at the start of the learning process. Okay? So that's generally when it will occur. So just like when you get diagnosed by a doctor at the start of your session, not at the end, okay? It's the same thing with learning. How much do students know about a particular topic? How well can students perform a particular skill? Okay? And the purpose of diagnostic assessment, just like it is for your doctor, is determining what's your starting point. Okay? Where are you in terms of the continuum of moving from novice scientist to expert scientist, for example? Where are you on that continuum so that as a teacher, we know how to move you a little bit more forward. The next line a little bit more forward again, and forward again, and forward again, okay? So that's where we can, assessment allows us to track the amount of progress that a learner is making as they're moving towards the expert end of the continuum. So there's two key things which define each of these learning processes: when the assessment occurs and the purpose. So the purpose of diagnostic assessment is what's your starting point? How much do you know? How well can you perform a task? Another key thing for us in science is identifying misconceptions. Yes, it's nice to find out what students currently know, but in terms of really driving forward the learning process, we also need to find out what students know incorrectly. And we've got a number of tools under our science tutoring toolkit, one of those being POE, which helps us direct in a more effective way dealing with those misconceptions. So the purpose, starting point, identifying misconceptions, and it happens prior to learning. Now, the examples column is really, really interesting because they're the tools that I've listed here. You can quiz them, you can do a KWL, you can do a mind map. There's a whole range of tools, but it's not the tool, the type of assessment isn't defined by the type of tool. The type of assessment is really defined by the purpose and the time, because you can do a quiz for diagnostic, but you can also do quizzes for the other types of assessment. Okay? So it's not the tool, it's the purpose and the timing which defines the type of assessment. There's another type of assessment that you do during the learning. And so this is what's called assessment as learning, formative. So when we look at the root word of formative, it is to form, to shape. So if you think about this in terms of sport or music, your sports coach or your piano teacher, what they're doing during your lessons is that they're providing information on your progress and your level of achievement to help you form that skill. So for example, if you're playing scales and you mistime something or you hit a bung key, then your teacher will provide immediate feedback, formative feedback. They're assessing how well you're doing, how well you played that scale, and they're providing feedback because what they're doing is helping you form or shape that skill. So sometimes it might be having you slow down playing the scale to help you play the correct notes. It might be to play the notes with you. It might be to discuss technique. It might be for you to hold your wrist up or something along those lines. But what the whole purpose is to form or shape the skill, form or shape the knowledge base. So in terms of a misconception, what that is about is reshaping or reconnecting ideas which are currently incorrectly connected within the brain of the learner. Okay? So while diagnostic occurred at the beginning of a learning episode, formative happens during the learning process. Okay? So, and this is not just restricted to providing written feedback on assessment work. This is the sitting down and talking students through a problem that they're working in class. This looks like that coach providing that one-on-one tutoring of providing corrective feedback if an athlete has incorrect motor patterns, or if an athlete has incorrect posture, or if a musician has incorrect posture. It's that corrective feedback, so that assessment in the moment and providing immediate and corrective feedback to help form and shape that either that piece of content, that conception, or that skill. Okay? That leaves the last type of assessment, summative. So if we look at the word if we look at the root word there, sum, what is the total? How much learning has either taken place? Now there's two things that we can think about when we think about summative learning. what is the sum total of knowledge which has been added to the concept inside the learner's brain, or how much progress has occurred. Okay, so you can look at those two things, level of achievement or progress has occurred. So for example, if we were in the gym and our goal was to work on our bench press, for example, we can look at progress there. Okay, so for example, if one day you could bench 40 kilograms, then progress would look like you being able to bench 42.5 kilos in the next session. That would be a summative assessment at the end of the session. Oh great, I can now bench 42.5 kilos or something along those lines. Okay, so what's important here are the purposes of each of these types of assessment. Okay, you'll sometimes see it referred to in the literature as diagnostic for, as, and of learning. Just know that this is how that it relates. So the two defining features of each of these forms of assessment are the purposes of the assessment and when they occur. So just to finish off the summative assessment, summative occurs at the end of the learning episode. Okay, so that might be at the end of the lesson where you use an exit ticket to assess how much learning has taken place during that lesson. It might be at the weekly revision test that you give your class to see how well they're keeping up with reviewing the material, or it might be at the end of term, end of semester, end of year exam. Important thing here is it is at the end of the learning episode. Okay, and so while tests and assignments are good examples of summative assessment, the examples aren't really the defining feature of these types of assessment. It's purpose and timing. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to watch and summarize the video back on slide 4. So that was the reading for this lecture. And then I want you to add information to this slide here. Okay, so add information to here, and remember, if you're going for a 1-star, you're going to add 3 points. If you're going to go for 2-star, then it's 5, and 3 is 7 points. Okay, so at the end of this lecture, you should have been able to describe, identify the 3 types of assessment, and also state their purpose, timing, and give me some examples of each type of assessment. Thank you very much.